Welcome to the TThe Medicine podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
We're going to be discussing the military in traditional African societies. In the last couple weeks or months, we've been talking about curriculum all the time and, African-centered education. But we got to also remember the need to focus on military education as well. And so to start your military education, you got to start with the history of military, and for us, in African societies. So you got to look at the history of military in traditional African societies. So I thought this old paper here would be a real good paper to, bring out to the folks tonight. Hopefully you guys enjoy to read. It'll be my first time reading the paper as well. Before I get into the paper, though, I just want to remind you guys that this show, the TThe Medicine podcast, is a part of a podcast network. And so I'm going to play a few spots from other shows on the TThe Medicine, on the KWAZ radio podcast network.
You are listening to the TThe Medicine podcast on KWAZ radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the TThe Medicine podcast on KWAZ radio.
All right, so there you have it. Make sure to go and check out the Harsh Reality podcast, as well as the Pro-Black Perspective and the Queen's Council on KWAZ Radio. Also, I haven't made the Discord invite link public or what have you, but if you are interested in joining the Discord, just hit me up and let me know. The Discord serves two purposes. One purpose is the project that we're working on to develop a new bona fide African-centered curriculum, as well as the Discord is going to act as a home online for this movement that we're trying to build behind this podcast. So you could join to take part in both. You could join to take part in the curriculum, or you could just join and take part in helping push the notoriety, I guess you could say, of the podcast out there a little bit more. Shout out to those who are listening live. I did see there was a couple of people in here. Shout out to you guys. So let us begin. So this paper, and by the way, stick around to the end. I have a kind of a free giveaway that's attached to the Discord if you stick around to the end. So here we are with this paper by S.C. UKPABI, UKPABI, called The Military in Traditional African Societies. This paper is from 1974. It was in a journal called Africa Spectrum. Although military establishments in Africa showed us many variations in their development and organization as the traditional societies which fashioned them, yet the former served the latter in similar ways. The military served as a means of maintaining or establishing a social order. Externally, it was used against other societies in order to maintain the balance of power or to create a new center of political power. As society's foremost instrument of violence, the military served not only the government, but also as the embodiment of a society's will. Consequently, a society, no matter how rudimentary, possessed a military organization whose fortunes had a direct bearing on the former's well-being or its disintegration. I want you to focus on that last sentence right there. Consequently, a society, no matter how rudimentary, possessed a military organization whose fortunes had a direct bearing on the former's, being the society's, well-being or its disintegration. If you're going to call yourself a nation like some folks in the West, well, in America do especially, right? Even, you look at Jamaica, the Bahamas, you look at any of the Caribbean, they have a defense force, if not an army. But to sit here as a population within a nation, as I've mentioned before, where is your army? Even in ancient Africa or traditional Africa, Africa of old, the most rudimentary nations had an army. And they understood that how the army performed directly determined how the state or the nation performed. Where is your army? The NFAC is not your army. The FOI is not your army. As a matter of fact, one of the things I always really marveled at when I was growing up in my hometown is, you had all these lynchings and stuff going on in America, and the FOI, to my knowledge, never descended in any of these towns to help the people there fight back. We know about, like, in the days of, King, Deacons of Defense, they organized and they had their, they practiced their Second Amendment rights and etc. But again, whose army were they a part of? You can't be just a group of people in a place and talking about this your shit when you don't have any military protection. One of the first things you do, we always talk about this education thing. Of course, you're educating to get the people you're educating to organize, to get the people mentally prepared to build a nation. But as you do that, who's this calling me? But as you do that, you also have to be preparing for war. For not just war, but to protect the people of the nation, right, that you're creating. So I ask you again, who is, or where is your army? So the next part of this paper is types of military organization. One can distinguish between three main types of military organizations in traditional African societies. In segmentary societies, a citizen army, or levy en masse, was raised as the need arose. This meant that every able-bodied man was liable for military service during periods of emergency, at the end of which the army was disbanded and the individuals took up once more this civilian occupation. Right? You could look at that as your army reserves, right? In well-established kingdoms, such as Dahomey and Ashanti, there existed a corps of professional soldiers whose number was supplemented by the calling up of able-bodied citizens to serve whenever necessary. A new level was reached in the 19th century in the total reliance on professional armies by such nation builders as King Shaka in South Africa, or Al-Hajj Umar ibn Tal, the Tukulor. There is noticeable evolutionary trend in the development of military organizations in traditional African societies. Initially wandering groups of people ensure their own safety against other groups by uniting for offense and defense, and by remaining constantly on their guard against the incursions of hostile groups. At this stage, the military factor exerted a preponderant effect on the lives of the people. Since the able-bodied men spent most of their time in martial activities or in anticipation of such activities, the economic and social activities were organized to suit this form of existence. At a later stage, these wandering groups might settle in a given location and consequently be confronted with a different kind of situation, which in turn would lead to a change in their military organization. Increase in population and incorporation of related groups would lead to a division of labor in the society and to more peaceful pursuits, which would be broken only long enough to enable the levy en masse to be called up to deal with problems requiring a military solution. Later still, and possibly through conquest, a kingdom or empire would be established in which a levy en masse might not even be considered adequate to deal with all the military commitments which such a political entity would be called upon to undertake. The result could be the existence of a professional army and even the rise of an officer class in the form of war chiefs. Arising from this argument is the proposition that a great deal of interaction existed between traditional societies and the type of military organization which they possessed. Segmentary societies in which each adult male was expected to help in defense of the society tended to be egalitarian. There was usually no warrior class which had the monopoly of arms and which could, as a result, acquire special privilege. That's an interesting point. That monopoly game is not our game. Nor did any group have the right to command others. Since such segmentary societies were based on kinship or cultural links, each individual in society was all the more willing to render military service, since it was quite clear that the individual survival in the face of external aggression was conterminous with the survival of the society. You see, this concept keeps appearing. Anytime you read anything about traditional Africa, right? You read about this society or community mindedness that our people had. Moreover, since the individual was called upon to defend his society, he also had much say in any deliberations which might result in his being called up for military service. It often happened that chiefs, elders, or priests of cults were entrusted with the task of assembling and leading the men to war. Read that again. It often happened that chiefs, elders, or priests of cults were entrusted with the task of assembling and leading the men to war. It's not like what you see in the West here, where a bunch of guys are comfortable on the mainland, like in America, and telling you, for those of you who served, or your children, for those of you who have children in the service, to go and take that hill in whatever, whatever brown country, whatever they're fighting in, right? Go take that hill, right? That's a comfortable command to give when you're sitting down in Washington on a telephone, right? It's a totally different thing when you, as the leader, as being the chief or elder or priest or whatever, totally different thing when you gotta take your black ass out there and fight too. I believe if you are a leader, like let's take Trump for example, or Obama before him, those guys had to go out there and actually fight with the soldiers, you wouldn't see as many wars as you tend to see, right? This, however, did not usually confer special privilege on them, since this was only one of the tasks which they performed for the society as the occasion demanded. And that's the thing, like, it's become a buzzword now, the warrior class. But clearly, the reality of it is every able-bodied man was capable and often called upon when the need was there to fight in a war. So that leads to the next question I have. The first question I had for y'all was, where is your army? And the next question I have for you now is, where's your training? Where's your military training? Let me tell you something. I keep hearing it said, well, the gangs was created to protect the community. Well, they're not protecting the community, and they haven't been doing it in quite a long time, if ever. If ever. I talked about this before. I watched this interview with what's this guy name? Melvin Farmer. It was on Vlad. And Melvin Farmer said something, and you see, this is another thing. We as a people got to start really listening to when people are talking. Melvin Farmer was one of the creators of a certain, I think it was a Crip set or whatever. And Melvin says, well, when we was committing our crimes and stuff like that, because nowadays he's kind of repentant and like kind of, sorry that he even created a set or whatever, guy. Because I listened to him carefully say, we used to do all our dirt within these blocks over here, and we knew not to cross over a particular street. I can't remember what the street is now, but we knew not to cross over a street because we knew that the crimes that we do over here, if we got caught, maybe we would get 4 or 5 years. But we knew if we cross that street and did that crime, aka go by them white folks and create that crime and commit that crime, you could get 20 years for that. And folks will just listen to that and don't think anything of it. Folks will listen to that and think nothing of it. When that guy is really saying some bitch shit right there. So y'all would have commit these crimes over here against your own people, or people who look like you. Because you'll get a little 4 years if something was to happen. But you wouldn't take your ass across that particular street, right? You won't cross this particular street because over there, them white folks gonna give you years. So then if that's your gangs, who's supposed to be protecting the community, if you consider that your warrior class, what do you think they're gonna do when they gotta face these other folks in war? They're not gonna bust a grape, much less a gun. So the streets is no training at all. The streets is an obstacle course. What we need is, and again, this has to be a part of it. This has to be a part of the education, right? Instead of going to PE and bouncing a ball and throwing a ball and all this shit, nothing against it. I used to play my basketball like crazy back in the day, right? You can still do that, that's fine. But there should be something in there that would at least get you, militarily thinking. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of the broadcast. This, however, did not usually confer special privilege on them, since this was only one of the tasks which they performed for the society as the occasion demanded. So these people have to stay ready. Stay ready. You don't have to get ready. They might receive a greater share of the booty, but they never set themselves up as a special military caste. Listen, that's the other thing that you see. You see a really good example of how poorly it's done here in America. You know, in medieval times, most often your soldiers, your knights or whatever, they got land and all kind of stuff for their service. That is if they lived. You look at America and you look at a place that will use, especially black folks, to go and fight these wars for them. And when you come back, if you're not careful, you're crazy and you're homeless. This is the thing that we need to do, especially if we're talking about nation building. You want a military around you, you have to treat your military well. A man can go there and put his life on the line protecting yours to come and sit down and eat the same meal you're eating. You keep that in mind. You keep that in mind. Because if that's the case, what stops another nation from making him a traitor to you? They'll just give him a better meal. So the people in your society who put in, you know, the militants in your society are putting their lives on the line should be treated well. Every time we hear one of the older, or, you know, the elders of black society, right, who pass on, oftentimes we hear them passing on in poverty. And those are soldiers, by the way. Different soldiers carry out different tasks. Those are soldiers too, by the way. I remember back home being in a math class and my teacher talking about Stokely Carmichael, you know, who later became Kwame Ture. And after he told us how great Kwame Ture was, he said, but you know, that man died poor. That man died broke. Was sick and died broke. And these are also our soldiers. They shouldn't have to go out like that. You hear Dr. Ben and them living in a hospice and have to accept donations. I think actually Tariq Nasheed paid for one of them their funeral. A part of the grift, but that's beside the point. Your soldiers, you have to take care of them. To continue, in segmentary societies, continuous military training or military service could not be reconciled with such economic activities as farming and trade, which were the normal occupation of the members of society. Neither could such a society engage in protracted wars. This was why military engagements were not allowed to last more than a few days, and casualties were reduced to the barest minimum. You see, there was a code of conduct in how Africans engaged each other. Such societies warring against one another generally sought not to decimate the other group with whom trading, marriage, and cultural ties were maintained under normal circumstances, but to achieve military equilibrium which would enable them to coexist in a given area. That's an interesting point, right? That's an interesting thought, right? We're not fighting to dominate, we're fighting to equilibrate, right? Therefore, we're not raping your women, we're not killing your men, we're not enslaving your children, right? We're just creating some balance in a society so that we could live together here. Keeping people honest is what we will say today. The military organization of segmentary societies was more conducive for defense than for offense. This was partly the result of the logistic difficulties which might arise if the society undertook campaigns of long duration, a long distance away from base, in addition to the fact that a greater determination and ready willingness were exhibited by the men in the defense of their homes than in offensive warfare. For those listening, a couple of you here live, is that a good strategy to more so focus on defense of your home than on offense? Put it in the chat if you wish to answer. Arising out of this preoccupation with defense was the fact that villages and towns were sited where they could be defended easily, such as on hilltops, difficult country, or in thickly wooded plains. It did happen that segmentary societies at some stage organized themselves for offense and created large principalities which altered the original military organization, promoted military professionalism, and led to the centralization of political power. Kingdoms, so I kind of answered the question, right? They eventually evolved to go on the offense more than just be on the defensive. Kingdoms and empires evolved elaborate and often complex military organizations. Their military needs were quite great. The royal court had to be defended adequately and the safety of the rulers assured. This necessitated the existence of a group of professional warriors who were charged with this responsibility and whose qualifications for office included unquestioned loyalty to the government in power. This military unit at the capital formed part of the standing army of the state. Large military units were often quartered in frontier regions for defense against invasion, while other units were deployed in other parts of the kingdom for internal security. A system was created to coordinate all military activities in the state. In the kingdom of Mani Congo, for instance, this was achieved by the creation of a ministry of war under the control of a minister. So like in the Caribbean, you hear this type of thing, like you hear the Minister of Tourism, Minister of Education, etc. They had something, I guess, similar in that sense. Elsewhere, military activities, as in the case of Ashanti, were regulated by the king. In times of emergency, selective conscription was resorted to in order to supplement the efforts of the standing army. Each chief in the outlying district was required to lead a certain number of his men to prearranged rendezvous where all the contingents were collected to form the national army for a particular war. The chiefs were required to command their men in the field, and a judicious system was worked out whereby those citizens used in a particular campaign were replaced in other campaigns by other citizens. So this tells you that the Africans traditional Africans were very organized, and that their organizing was dynamic. They did, they learned, and they redid. Right? And again, I ask the question, where is your army now? All this hemming and hee-hawing about being, this y'all shit and blah, blah, blah. Where is your army now? And I'm not picking on folks, by the way. I'm trying to enlighten. Sometimes when you enlighten, you gotta be a little bit tough about it. But where's your army? Shout out to the chat room. I see The pro-black perspective is here. He says, now I want to go do some push-ups. Yeah. Yep. The pro-black perspective also says we need that military training. Absolutely. Kevin Donaldson says Africans must defend our home base. And that's the thing, like, you know, and again, this is why ultimately America is not the place for African people, because this is their nation. They control everything here. You know, they control everything here. They can even if you had an army, they'll starve you out. They'll put up blockades and stop the bullets from getting to you, stop the guns from getting to you, stop food from getting to you wherever you are. You know, why you think the U.S., as mighty as it's purported to be, couldn't win in Vietnam? You gotta think about this kind of stuff. So again, where is your army? But also, where is your home base? But here's the thing, at the end of this, and I've talked about this idea I had in the past, and lo and behold, these European folks are doing that same idea I had, but I'm gonna talk about it at the end of the broadcast. Where was I? I might reread a part here. Elsewhere, military activities, as in the case of Ashanti, were regulated by the king. In times of emergency, selective conscription was resorted to, in order to supplement the efforts of the standing army. Each chief in the outlying district was required to lead a certain number of his men to prearrange rendezvous where all the contingents were collected to form the national army for a particular war. I did read this. The chiefs were required to command their men in the field, and a judicious system was worked out whereby those citizens used in particular campaign were replaced in other campaigns by other citizens. So yeah, that's why I had stopped when I had said that, you know, they were highly organized and they were scientific in their warring. Clearly they looked at what worked, what didn't, and they changed up appropriately. But in the final analysis, the kingdom depended on a certain group of levies for its security. This group would generally include those from the heartland of the kingdom. The heartland of the kingdom. Where is your kingdom? Thus, the Ashanti levies from the Confederate states around Kumasi became the most important and loyal group, while in Dahomey, the inhabitants of the Dahomey Plateau and the descendants of the conquering Aja formed the most important units of the Dahomean levies. This arrangement conferred on these groups certain privileges which distinguished them from the inhabitants of the other parts of the kingdom. To them went certain positions of command in the army. In addition to a greater proportion of the war spoils. Again, you have to take care of the people protecting you. Since kingdoms and empires in Africa south of the Sahara were created largely through military conquest, their military establishments were organized more for offense than for defense, and this affected all aspects of life in the society. At the same time as creating the opportunity for military specialization and the development of military professionalism. The consolidation and expansion of the empire led to increased military activities, which in turn made it necessary to maintain a large body of men under arms for a long period. For instance, the Dahomean Standing Army was estimated at 12,000 in 1845. Most of the members of this standing army came from the levies raised for particular campaigns, but later retained in military service after the expedition. In this way, a large number of the civilian population was removed from its occupation and used in a special role, right? Don't just be a civilian, right? The standing army itself meant that the ruler had an armed instrument in which to subordinate and intimidate the unarmed population, a situation which not only created social stratification, but also enhanced the position of the king against the local chiefs whose concurrence was required in the past before war was declared or a campaign undertaken. A standing army was an economic drain on the resources of the state, since such an army had to be paid in cash or in kind. It also had to be armed at state expense, and the provision of horses for the cavalry and guns for the infantry required a large capital. At the same time, an idle standing army constituted a danger to its employers. In order to utilize the soldiers for providing the means for their pay and to engage their attention in war, the rulers found it necessary to send them to war constantly. Does that sound familiar? Standing armies consequently gave rise to continued warfare, which yielded booty and slaves, part of which was used to pay the troops. Booty and slaves. Among the Yoruba of Oyo, the rule that Kakanfo must go to war frequently, at least once every 3 years, was supposed, among other things, to be a way of keeping the Yoruba general and his army busy. Do we see this in America? That's my next question. Is this seen in America, and is it seen for the same reasons in America? Yeah. A standing army could be sent on a long campaign in a distant area without bringing the state's political and economic organization to a halt. The troops of Benin or Yoruba in the 19th century, trying to subdue a rebellious district or to conquer a new territory, were accompanied by relations or wives who looked after the men in the military camps. Every soldier was expected to fend for himself in food and other necessaries, and sometimes even to provide himself with weapons. That's wild. In long campaigns, the women and the non-combatants grew crops near the camps, assisted in the repair of the thatched huts, and carried out trade designed to supply some of the needs of the troops. It did happen that sometimes these troops never returned to the metropolis, but set themselves up in their new abode and organized a system of government and social institutions similar to what they were used to in their former towns. Elaborate military establishments encouraged the growth of such associated industries as blacksmithing and the manufacture of shields. For instance, blacksmiths manufactured iron swords, cutlasses, and arrows, and it is relevant to know that in some kingdoms, such as among the Yoruba, Ogun, the god of iron, was also the god of war. And, you know, I probably shouldn't even bring it up, but you'll hear like a Tariq Nasheed talking about Ogun all the time, but you're not African. You see how confused it is? It's just a ball of confusion and mix up, right? That ain't nothing but Ogun, but you are Native American. A particular significance with the role, and let me just address this real quick. If you're offended that I bring up that kind of stuff, you need to ask yourself, why are you offended? If I'm pointing out the truth to you that, you know, Ogun, the god of iron, was also the god of war amongst the Yoruba, right? If you're claiming that you're not African, you use different people, then why are you bringing up Ogun all the time? Because it sounds good, because it's a part of your grifting. I mean, come on. Y'all got to start questioning these inconsistencies. Of particular significance was the role played by hunters in war. In some states, they were used as scouts and were formed, whenever necessary, into a paramilitary organization which was charged with watching over the security of the town or village. Hunting provides suitable training for war since it inculcated the spirit of adventure, daring, courage, patience, and persistence in stalking wild and dangerous animals. I'm gonna tell you something. These white folks, they still hunt. Before the pandemic, I overheard two white guys talking about hunting that they was gonna do this past summer. A part of the reason why you hunted, this is it right here. You get exposed to the elements, to rough terrain, to strategizing, to, you know, etc. Right? It's an adventure, it's daring. You know, you have to have some courage. You have to be patient to stalk out whatever animal it is you're hunting, you know? And back in the days, in certain circumstances, you were dealing with animals that were a threat to you. You better not miss, type thing. It also happened that the same weapons used for hunting animals were also used for war, and the proficiency in handling them in hunting resulted in proficiency in weaponry in combat. If I suggested to the average person, the average African person out here, hey, let's go camping. Oh, cool, we'll rent a cabin and stuff. No. Let's really go camping. Let's go in the woods with tents, right? With the, you know, put the phones away. You know, we spent a couple of days out in the wild, just cooking food on fire, etc., drinking water and making sure that we have enough water to last us and all this kind of stuff. Most African people tell me no. Most black folks will tell me, hell no. But because I've been around these Eurasians and situations of work and whatnot, I know for a fact these guys do that. Not all, not every one of them, but a good significant number of them do that. You know, that's what the scouts and all that stuff was. And that's a question I've asked in the past, like, where are our scouts even? Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, where are our scouts? You know, the whole idea of that scout thing was really to train up young military people. In the chat room, KW Don 7, I know who this is, says that the pimp should make up a FBA deity and leave Ogun alone. Make up a if that's what y'all really pushing on, then make up your own. Or go follow one of your Native American deities. Who knows a Native American deity? Write the name in the chat if you know one. And follow that person. But it's just disingenuous at this point. And you guys are eating that shit up and following along. It doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent as hell. It's inconsistent, and it really takes you away from the work that you really need to be doing. The stuff that I talk about on this show, the stuff that you'll hear only time I say talk about on his show, stuff that you'll hear from Harsh Reality, that's the stuff y'all need to be focusing on. There's work to be done, and you're not doing it. And you're being inconsistent as hell in whatever it is you are doing. So that brings us to this session called The Effects of the Military on Traditional Societies. One of the major effects of the military on traditional societies, particularly among such groups as the Maasai and the Zulus, which could be described as states in arms, was the military orientation of cultural values. Songs and dances extolled military valor, and the dominant values of life became those of the warrior. Songs and dances extolled military valor, and the dominant values of life became those of the warrior. What do we have now? Songs and dances that extol the dusty street dudes that kill up one another. I was watching a video, was it yesterday? Could have been yesterday. Some other rapper, you know, out here somewhere got killed again. You know, just a couple weeks back, a pretty, I mean, as far as today's music goes, a pretty big name rapper was killed, right? And it's just stupid how the dude, got himself. If you think Nate Robinson got knocked out, real dumb. This dude who got killed a couple weeks back, real stupid stuff. The dude I was looking at yesterday just had a song, just recently had a song out, talking about shooting up people and getting shot, and then these dudes ran up on him. He didn't get to bust a shot. They shot him in the back, he started rolling on the ground, and they shot him up and finished it. That's what the songs and the dance amongst our population, especially, that's what we're doing. It's self-destruction. Among the Zulu, a man was called the War Shield of the King. And a man's main ambition became to win honor in the battlefield or to fulfill himself in the service of the king. Military organizations in kingdoms and empires provided the opportunity for specialization in the use of certain arms, which in turn made it possible for such states to extend their ascendancy over contiguous people. Some African armies comprised a cavalry arm, foot soldiers who fought with swords and lances, archers, and infantry armed with guns. Proficiency in fighting on horseback, on the use of the gun, required special and prolonged training. The mastery of these instruments of wars conferred on the troops a great advantage over soldiers who fought with swords and spears. For instance, Oyo ascendancy in the 16th and 17th centuries was achieved through the use of cavalry, which also limited the southward expansion of the empire, since cavalry could not operate in the dense forests of the south. Similarly, the ascendancy of Ashanti and Dahomey in the 19th century was attributable to the importation of a large number of guns, which gave their armies immense advantage over their neighbors. The survival of Moshesh and the Basuto kingdom in the troubled period following the Mefeking was the result of the people becoming a nation of mounted gunmen. So clearly they're talking, a lot of this paper is talking about that period after Africans started getting guns from Europeans and stuff, right? This was quite common to find the army of a state divided into wings or units depending on the weapons with which such units were armed. This division gave rise to esprit de corps among the troops serving in the same unit and made it necessary for the commander of such a unit no longer to be the chief of an outlying district, but a soldier who had distinguished himself in the use of the weapon in question in many battles. In time, a class of professional commanders emerged whose loyalty or otherwise had a far-reaching effect on the fortunes of the state. Military specialization and technique, therefore, produced two contrary effects on the state. On the one hand, a good and loyal standing army specializing in the use of certain weapons strengthened the centripetal forces in the state and used the superior skills to subdue distant regions. Okay. On the other hand, unless such an army was permeated with patriotism, a stage would be reached when the troops would consider their interests as overriding those of the state and would proceed either to establish their own rule or to withdraw their allegiance to the rulers, thereby bringing about the disintegration of the state. So what does that tell you about education and militancy? Remember we talked about it a few weeks or some months ago, that your education has to be done in such a way where it creates patriotic leaders. Well, that's also true that it needs to create patriotic soldiers or patriotic leadership amongst your military, right? Because if not, what ends up happening is troops will start looking at their own interests first. And this is why I say you gotta take care of the people who are defending you. That's number one. Number two, you also got to make sure these folks who are defending you are patriotic enough to put their personal interests to the side. So that's where that education of communalism and all that stuff has to be solid, solid, solid. You want to talk about building a nation, keep these things in mind. Because if those things aren't solid in the men and women who are going to defend that nation, they might start to seek out their own interests. And when that happens, you lose your nation. You don't have your defenders. Your nation is lost. The next section is called the role of women, slaves, and mercenaries in traditional armies. Before I read that, let me take a quick station break, take a sip of water, and I'll be right back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. And we're back. And we're continuing this paper that's looking at the military and traditional African societies. And we reached this section of the paper that's called the role of women, slaves, and mercenaries in traditional armies. And before I continue, I want to shout out the soldiers that are in the chat room and the ones who are listening to this show live, as it's being live streamed right now. Shout out to you soldiers as well. In indigenous societies, women were used widely not only to provide support for the soldiers in war, but also in a combatant role. The part played by women in looking after an army engaged in a distant war has been noted already. Their role in a besieged town or village was very pronounced. They attended to the wounded, looked after the food and the children, and hid these in places where they would not fall into the hands of the enemy. They brought food and replacements for the armaments to the defenders of the city wall or in the perimeter of the town or village. In extremities, they armed themselves and fought side by side with their menfolk. At other times, they were used in the offensive. For instance, Clapperton reported that part of Bellow's army, which attacked Gober in 1826, was made up of women slaves. He cited a particularly brave old woman who rode astride a horse and was found where the battle was thickest. At a later date, the Sultan of Baghurmi was reported to possess a large number of female slaves who accompanied him into battle and whose duty included taunting cowards to an assumption of courage. Shaka, in reorganizing his military establishment, organized the young women into segments similar to those of men. And I hope you all realize that Shaka, a lot of his tactics are still studied in, to my understanding, are still studied in U.S. military, U.S. and British military. The women assisting in the agricultural work needed to feed the male regiments quartered in a particular military town. They also took part in ceremonial dances. Whenever a male regiment was released from military service, a female regiment was also dissolved and given as brides to the men. That I didn't know. How many of you guys listening would fight to defend an African nation? Like what we've been talking about, building this nation, making Africa a power, right? 50 plus countries within Africa, but making the whole continent a power. How many of you would be willing to fight for that nation? And would you want a wife, if you're single, would you want a wife who has also seen battle? And for women, would you be willing to fight to protect the nation? Or would you want a husband who's seen battle? The use of women as soldiers reached its highest level in the Dahomean army. In 1845, the kingdom had 5,000 women as part of its standing army. In the second half of the 19th century, there were two distinct types of army in Dahomey. On the one hand, there was a standing army of male and female warriors, and on the other hand, a reserve army of all able-bodied men and women capable of bearing arms. A century earlier, the rulers of Dahomey used to enlist some of their wives as soldiers during periods of extreme emergency. That's why I say, man, everyone has to be ready to fight, right? Under King Gezo, who usurped the throne in 1818, the use of women as soldiers was institutionalized. Gezo felt himself so insecure at first and doubted the loyalty of the male soldiers that he created among the palace women a military unit which served as his bodyguard and which defended him in any civil conflict. That's an interesting thought. This is why when I have the opportunity to, I tell women, don't emulate men. Men are the worst. Don't emulate them. right? Like, when I say they're the worst, I mean they're not, you know, acting like a man is not the business, right? You have enough examples of women who held it down. And to take up some of the obnoxious behaviors of men is just not the, it's just not the deal. Let me tell you something, men don't trust men that much. And here you are trying to emulate men. How am I going to trust you? So you know, King Gezo here was like, nah, I don't trust these dudes around me. Too tough. Let me get some women around me. Right? In the chat room, KW Don 7 says, in order for Africans to achieve liberation, we have to function as an individual collective, as opposed to the status quo of being a collective of individuals. Yeah, the problem is we have gone away. We've adopted the oppressor type way, right? We can't be individuals like that. We have to really, I don't know if you heard the last few episodes, KW Don 7, but, you know, we've been talking about this idea of Ubuntu, this idea of community or communalism. That's what we really got to get back to. I am because you are type stuff, you know? We got to get back to that. Recruited from captive slaves of non-Dahomian origin, these Amazons gave their loyalty to the king who owned and maintained them. By the time Gezo died in 1858, the Women Corps had become such a vital arm of the state's defense system that enlistment was extended to all women capable of bearing arms. In times of war, the reserve female units guarded the palace and the capital. In battle, they wore uniforms similar to the men's, fought in the front ranks, and showed as much courage and tenacity as their male counterpart. In their youth, these women soldiers were celibate and were forbidden to marry until they reached middle age. Well, I know, okay, never mind. Even then, they still needed the king's consent to marry. In peacetime, they maintained themselves by making pots and carving calabashes, which were their exclusive monopoly. So this is a profile of women who are active in the military. By sharing with their menfolk in the perils inherent in warfare, and by rising as the occasion demanded in defense of their state, the women were accorded great respect in their societies. And that's the thing, like, we are facing perils out here in this modern world. And really the best way we're going to get through it is, number one, our women have to see the perils, right, which many do. And two, they gotta be willing to rise up in defense. You gotta be able to see this, and I could do a whole other show on this, but this idea of the disposable male type stuff, that's a European thinking, right? We always had someone who had our backs. And that's what our women, you know, really have been traditionally to us. Some of them, as the rulers of their people, showed great valor in leading their armies to battle. The military service gave them much influence on the ordering of the political and social life of these societies. For instance, in the Dahomian court, senior women had the same ranks and status as state ministers. There was a female counterpart of the prime minister and another counterpart of the Mu, the second most powerful minister in the state. In addition, the upkeep of the court and the royal tombs was mainly in their hands, while many of them acted as the king's advisors and enjoyed his absolute confidence. The use of slaves, usually regarded as belonging to the lowest class in indigenous society, as soldiers was practiced widely in Africa south of the Sahara, although much more is known about their activities as soldiers in those parts of Africa which came under some form of Muslim influence than in the non-Muslim parts. This could be accounted for partly by the extensive documentation of slaves' activities in the Muslim areas visited by Muslim scholars and European travelers. In segmentary societies, the owner of slaves usually expected the latter to come to his aid whenever his person was in danger, and it was not uncommon to find slaves joining in the defense of the village or town of their master. In the Eastern, because the concept of slavery was different. The concept of slavery was different. The treatment of a slave was different. In the Eastern Sudan, the Fun employed a large slave army whose activities helped in the expansion of the Fun Empire. In 19th century Bornu, Al-Kanami used many slave soldiers in his expeditions. It was even reported that his commander-in-chief was of the slave class. Al-Kameni did not have a centralized armed force, but relied on the contingents, often of slaves, which his dignitaries were prepared to equip and to contribute for their national cause. In such instances, the commanders of the contingents were generally of the slave class. Consequently, the structure of the military forces of Bornu made it necessary for slaves to be in constant demand. From the Sokoto Caliphate, the rebellion of Hadejia against Sokoto in the middle of the 19th century yielded the story of a slave warrior who fought so bravely in the ranks of the army of Hadejia that the blood of his foes cemented his hand on his great spear. To the west, the initial forces which Al-Hajj Umar used against Bambara in 1850 included many slaves, some of whom were later given important military commands. So again, this writer is using available texts to get his information from. And we know that the Arabs kept a lot of documentation, like was mentioned a few sentences back in this paper. So yeah, we're gonna hear about some Arabs, some Arabized Africans as well in this paper. Certain African rulers used slave soldiers as a means of creating a centralized administration aimed at enhancing the authority of the monarchs against the competition of their subordinate chiefs. For instance, threatened by the revolt of one of his chief officials in 1500, the Sultan of Kano survived this through the support of the slave warriors, one of whom he appointed to a position of eminence in the state. In the latter part of the 19th century, the rulers of Zaria appointed slave generals to command their armies, partly in order to forestall the rebellion of certain dignitaries in the state, and partly because these were the only people whom they could trust to defend the state against invaders. Similarly, Kabaka Kalema of Buganda in the late 19th century, when he found himself losing popular support, relied for his safety on the Arabs and their bands of slaves. The use of slaves for the defense of the state and as a prop for individual rulers had its own dangers, since some slaves or their commanders tended to overreach themselves or to bring about the collapse of the government through their excesses. In Kayar, Senegal, the excesses of the slave soldiers at the end of the 17th century caused the inhabitants to carry out a successful revolt against the ruler. again, treat the people defending you well. How you have a slave? I mean, the idea is just ridiculous. Similarly, the collapse of the Funj dynasty in the 18th century has been attributed partly to the over-reliance of the rulers on slave soldiers. Pardon me. At the end of the 13th century, the situation had deteriorated to such an extent that the throne of Mali was seized by Sakura, a freed slave. With the rise of professional army and the overdependence of certain rulers on slave soldiers, there was the danger that the commanders of such standing armies could turn against their masters or could interfere in political matters. Faced with this situation, the clever rulers kept their throne by encouraging rivalry amongst the slaves, by playing the dignitaries against the slaves, and by similarly executing slave commanders as the need rose. Yeah, the thing with power is that it plays games, right? Power tends to play games. That's why when you're talking about nation building, you have to set up. You have to set it up in a way where you could limit how many games those in power can play against those not in power. And I think those power dynamics is not about European or African or what have you. I think it's just about human, right? I think it's just about a human type thing. There was little doubt that the use of slaves as warriors made it possible for some of these slaves to attain the highest posts in the land, to rise in social status, and to use their acquired positions of authority to lord it over the freeborn. And right there you get an idea of how the system of slavery was different in the continent, right, than what you saw here in America, where chattel slavery was the preferred slavery. Like in these places in the continent, you actually had some ability to flex. You could rise up socially, especially if you're fighting for the nation, right? And you could become, a dignitary, so to speak, in a nation. During chattel slavery, there was no mobility. It is necessary to mention the role of mercenaries in African warfare. These warriors who sold their services for money or booty were hired for several, you could pause, by today's standards, there'll be a pause in here, right? Money or booty were hired for several reasons, one of which was to utilize their special skills in weaponry. In the 19th century, part of the bodyguard of the Asantehene in Kumasi comprised Hausas who had seen military service under the British or French and consequently possessed proficiency in handling Snider rifles. Al-Hajj Umar made special efforts to enlist skilled African soldiers from French Senegal to man the artillery pieces captured from the French and to drill his troops. As his fame grew, Umar attracted into his army adventurers from far and wide in search of booty. Let me just say money. In search of, let me just say riches. In search of riches, who were very proud to serve under such a renowned general. Other mercenaries were hired simply to augment the forces of one party in an armed struggle or to do the fighting for a group unable or too weak to challenge a stronger opponent. For instance, in March 1845, the king of Porto Novo hired ISO warriors to attack Badagry and a day-long naval engagement began between the two groups until darkness fell. In the 17th century, an English traveler, Thomas Phillips, reported that the Akan at Cape Coast hired the warriors of Asibu in their war against the king of Efutu, a combination which overwhelmed the people of Efutu and caused them to abandon their capital. Among the Temne of Sierra Leone, the use of mercenaries was widespread. TThe Military organization centered on the war chief, some of whom possessed enough influence and wealth to raise a band of warriors. But the chiefs, instead of leading their bands to battle, usually hired outstanding warriors of proven ability and from any ethnic group to lead them against whomsoever the chief might wish. Even the warrior bands comprised men from several ethnic groups who were willing to sell their services for wages. In order to raise such a band, the war chief would give his leading warriors a large amount of goods, which was then taken to other chiefs in other areas, from whom the warriors would ask permission to recruit more warriors, as well as pass through their countries with their recruits. Through these means, warriors were collected from a variety of chiefdoms and peoples, and some would come from more distant places because the fame of the war leader had attracted them. They were rewarded for their services with rights of plunder and portion of the value of any slaves they might capture. Many of the famous generals in West Africa began their career by offering their military services to those that needed them. Interesting. Bai Bura, who was to offer such military resistance to the British forces in the Hood Tax War of 1898 in Sierra Leone, began his military career by creating a warrior band, which by 1865 was hired by the paramount chief of Rowula to aid a subordinate chief. Later, Bure was to give his services to the British in 1892, as a result of which he was able to observe the fighting techniques of the West India regiments of Sierra Leone. Similarly, Samori Touré's fame was as a skilled soldier, began during the services as a mercenary in the pay of Sori Barama, the king of Bisandugu. So, names and places aside, right? The idea here is that, and this goes back to the curriculum stuff and the philosophy behind it. If you have a skill, you have a place within any country, any nation. If you have a skill, right? If we're building up a superpower in Africa, and you have the skill of, you are a mercenary or what have you, you're good with weaponry, you're good with tactics, etc. There's a place for you there. You can go there and help to protect the nation. And it's not just with wars, about any problem that people need solutionaries for, you can be that. And we're seeing it here in these stories talking about war. You got Africans who had skills, and their history was a good marketing strategy. They were able to jump back and forth. They were able to go to where their skills were needed, and that's what you got to focus on. Put all the names and stuff aside that you probably don't know. I'm not aware of all these different people, but I get the gist of what's being told to me here. You have a skill, you have a place to call home. Mercenaries observe certain codes of conduct. They offer to serve under renowned generals who had something to offer them in the form of the acquisition of military techniques and the opportunity for wealth through success in battle. Again, once you have something to offer, you have something to gain. Among the commanders themselves, there was the understanding that they must believe in the cause they fought for before they offered their services to one party in a war. Neither was it common for them to switch their allegiance from one party to another. In Igbo land, in eastern Nigeria, the famous Abam and Ohafia warriors who undertook military engagements in various parts of the territory in the 19th century did not simply offer their services to anyone who wanted to hire them. Since they were the allies of the people of Arochukwu, who possessed the oracle Ibn UKPABI, and who used their military allies to enforce the verdict of the oracle, the Aro became the agents through whom these warriors could be made available to any Igbo town which needed them. In this way, the Aro used them to safeguard their trading and political interests in parts of Igbo land. Among the people of the Abam and Ohafia, military achievements were idealized and commemorated in songs and dances. The baptism of fire in the battlefield and any tangible evidence of having vanquished an enemy in hand-to-hand combat became the true test of manhood. The baptism of fire. And, you know, for modern day thinking, again, if you're trained, and this is one of the problems I've always had with black folks who went into the American military, especially in recent times. Like, you go into this military, none of y'all ever come back and trained, you know, folks in the community, or hardly any of you, I should say, come back and really train, really go out there and grab some of these youths off the street doing dumb shit and really train them. You know, I had an older American black guy tell me one time, he served in I think Vietnam or something. And he told me that, you know, what the one thing about the youth out here doing all this gang stuff in the streets, he said if they went into the military, at least they'll learn something and they'll be, you know, they'll become men or whatever, or, you know, what have you. The problem is they don't become our men, so, you know, so to speak. Right? They go in the military and they, you know, they switch up. I'll put it like that. But we need something where we got these folks, I mean, at least if you're going to go and fight in the U.S. military, come back and bring some of that training to us and help us get ourselves together, you know, and be able to put up some resistance in these communities where we live, should something go down. And these are the folks that we need to, you know, those people who have gone through the battle, who have been on the battlefield, who have accomplished something by way of, you know, victory and stuff like that. Those are people we need to really be boosting up. They've passed the test of manhood. Those are people we got to be boosting up. Above all, mercenaries as a group tended to develop trans-ethnic loyalties and valued comradeship in arms more than kinship ties. This takes us to a section called Military and Political Matters. Are you folks still with me in the chat room? Seems like everyone is still around who was there before. Thanks for sticking around. Military and political matters. The danger that military commanders of whatever social status would interfere in political matters was something an African ruler had to guard against, and in many states there were provisions aimed at minimizing this interference in order to prevent a civil war or the collapse of the established government. In Mosi, the Tapsoba, the commander of the infantry, had enormous military influence, but he was forbidden to have his headquarters in the state capital. Instead, he resided in one of the 4 military camps located away from the capital. After 3 years in office, he was ritually put to death. Wow, plot twist. I didn't see that coming. Hold on. So, in Morsi, they had a commander of the infantry who had this enormous military, and with that, a lot of influence. But they didn't let his ass anywhere near the capital because of that reason. And after 3 years in office, he was ritually put to death. God damn. It was also significant that the main forces of the state were not quartered near the state capital, but were located near the frontiers of the kingdom. In discussing this problem as it affected the Oyo Empire, Ajayi argued that the Kakanfo, commander-in-chief, was so influential that he became the rival of the king of Oyo, and in this way raised the problem of how to prevent clashes between the civil and military administration. It was a problem inherent in the emergence of the Iso military chiefs probably instituted in the 17th century as a semi-professional class of warriors with an esprit de corps and ideas of values and its own, but it usually took the form of how to keep their leader, the Kakanfo, away from the politics of the capital and the whole Oyo Empire. So let me ask this question here too. You guys think this became necessary because of the contact with Europeans? Do you think the European contact influenced the way things happen in these so-called traditional, because in a sense, these don't seem to be traditional military, right, in African societies. This sounds like it's talking more like militaries after their encounter with the Europeans. And I'm wondering, maybe you guys know something more than me, do you guys think or know that this only happened because of the prior contact with Europeans, or is this just a human thing? Is this just people being people, and so you have to be careful of people? There were several devices intended to insulate the Kakanfo from politics. The title was conferred on the greatest soldier and tactician of the day, but care was usually taken not to select members of the royal lineage or anyone likely to combine political influence at Oyo with his military power and prestige. So clearly there was a separation of things. He was not allowed to reside in the capital. He was supposed to go to war frequently, at least once every 3rd year, to conquer or be brought home a corpse within 3 months. To give him some scope for exercising power, he was made ruler of an outlying district, usually in an area of the empire most threatened by external foes. But his rule was expected to be eccentric and irresponsible, his subjects tolerating it only in the knowledge that it would be for a short while, and that if the Kakanfo lived long enough, he would at least bring them lustre with his fame or riches from his conquests. Who takes this job? Who's growing up and says, I want to be the Kakanfo in the future? Military rulers like Shaka solved the problem of the overmighty commanders by becoming their own commanders-in-chief. Shaka appointed and dismissed his commanders at will, or sent them constantly on campaigns which kept them away from the capital. So that's the thing. And this is especially true, I would say, of men. You gotta keep your eye on them. And sometimes the easiest way to keep your eye on them, send them far away from where you are. Make sure you guys hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure subscribe, click the bell so that when I go live, you'll be notified and you could hop on in. It's nicer to read these papers when there's some commentary going on in the chat room, questions being asked or what have you. So make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, click the bell to be notified when I'm live again. Like I've been doing for the past month or more, maybe 2 months. I'm trying to have a show every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. You should expect a live stream from me for the foreseeable future. In spite of these safeguards, several commanders were still able, by their action, to shatter the established political system. Giza, who was a very skillful warrior, used his genius to wrest the throne of Dahomey in 1818. Having done this, he proceeded to recognize the army and the government, to reorganize the army and the government to ensure that he himself was not overthrown. And this is what you see often with these powers around the world, but especially in Africa. Like, they have a coup, they take power, and then they do a whole bunch of reorganizing to make sure that no one else can stage a coup on them, right? At least the more successful of these. In fact, the more successful of these kind of dictator types are actually backed in some form by some European nation as well. His activities and his long rule of 40 years contributed to the development of royal absolutism in Dahomey in the 19th century. Similarly, the revolt of Afonja, who succeeded for a while in making Ilorin independent of Oyo, not only contributed to the collapse of Oyo, but proved that the safeguards worked out for insulating the Kakanfo from politics could be illusionary. Nowhere in Africa south of the Sahara in the 19th century did the military have such far-reaching effect on traditional societies as in southern Africa, where constant warfare among the Bantu and the military innovations arising therefrom brought about revolutionary changes whose effects were felt in Zululand to Tanganyika in the north. These wars necessitated the emergence of standing and professional armies and changes organizations. Conflicts in themselves have been known to increase in tactics, which in turn brought about changes in Bantu social and political pace of social change. In Zululand, they stimulated the adaptation of existing institutions along militarist lines. For instance, the age grade system became the basis for the establishment of the age grade regiments, which Shaka used as the means of assimilating rapidly the conquered peoples through the enlistment of their able-bodied men and women into the appropriate units. Initiation ceremonies, which involve circumcision and a period of ritual seclusion, had no place in the new scheme of things. Social habits and customs were encouraged or eliminated depending on how far they promoted or hindered the military interests of the rulers. Politically, these military developments gave rise to large and centralized kingdoms comprising different ethnic groups, which replaced the small and clan-based political units of old. Interesting. These new kingdoms tended to concentrate a great deal of political power in the hands of the ruler and subverted the traditional role of subordinate chiefs. A new crop of leaders emerged whose main qualification for political office lay in their military prowess. Men like King Shaka of Zululand, Moshesh, the founder of the Basuto nation, Zwangendaba, the general who led the Zulu migrants into Tanganyika, and Faku, the chief of Pondoland, who defended his people against foreign invaders, rank among the greatest figures in African history in the 19th century. How many of these folks that I just listed, outside of Shaka, how many of these leaders, the greatest figures in African history in the 19th century, how many of these leaders did you know of before this reading? I'm going to put that in the comment section. From Zululand and its neighborhood, from Zululand and its neighborhood, defeated groups migrated northward into Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, and Tanganyika, taking with them their new cultural and political conceptions into these new areas. Sometimes they modified their concepts to suit the circumstances in which they found themselves, but generally their intrusion became the occasion for far-reaching social and political changes among their unwilling hosts. On the other hand, some groups like the Basuto, who were indirectly affected by events in Zululand, reacted to this by clustering together in large supra-tribal communities. Subsequently, they evolved new military and political systems, which made it possible for them to survive in the new situation in which they found themselves. You see, situations dictate how you progress. This idea that you're going to just do it this one way and that's it is foolishness. And this idea that you're just going to be your own one group and do whatever is foolishness as well. Sometimes you have to work with other ethnic groups. These wars in Southern Africa led to social fragmentation over a wide area. There was a change in the pattern of population distribution. Some groups which survived the conflagration tended to expand and to absorb weaker groups. Others, like the Kololo, abandoned their homeland and migrated northwards to establish an empire in Borotsland. The pattern, if you can, because I'm reading this thing in the chat, if anyone's willing to, tell me where the empire in Borotsland is today. The pattern of economic activities also changed. Some sedentary groups, like the Lokwa, who had been driven from their homes and had in the process lost their means of livelihood, became predatory and brought woe to the weaker groups whom they encountered in their wandering. In addition, crafts associated with war, such as blacksmithing and shield making, were encouraged, and the women regiments under Shaka were given the task of producing the food needed by the army. Since most of the kingdoms and empires established in Africa south of the Sahara were largely the result of one group or several groups establishing their suzerainty over others, I guess I meant they probably mean sovereignty over others through conquest, these conquest states showed a high degree of social stratification and military organization, which seemed to leave military power in the hands of the conquering groups. The situation in the interlacustrine region in East Africa, from Bunyoro to Rwanda between the 17th and the 19th centuries, illustrates this clearly. In this region, an ethnically distant aristocracy known as Hema in the north and Tutsi in the south established their authority over the original Bantu inhabitants. In Ankoli, For instance, as soon as the Bahima, who were cattlemen, had conquered the Bairu, they had to work out a political and military system best suited to safeguard their own ascendancy. They also had to defend their cattle and their Bairu subjects from external attack. This in turn led them to conquer other less strongly organized cattle people whose subjugation became a necessary feature of state defense. The conquered Bairu, who had no affinity with the Bahima, possessed inferior social and legal status and were obligated to pay tribute to their overlord. The Bahima constituted themselves into the nucleus of the Ankoli kingdom, and all government functions were in their hands. In maintaining the differential relationships which existed in the kingdom, the Bahima relied on military power. At the head of the military organization was the Mugabe, which is the king. He ordered his chiefs to form warrior bands for the protection of the borders or the defense of the kingdom, as the case might be. While every Mugima was reliable for military service, the Bairu were excluded from the service. Thus, the latter lacked any military discipline and training which would have helped them to alter their inferior status through military action. There is the view that the ability of the Hema and the Tutsi to dominate the Bantu agriculturalists was partly the result of their superiority as fighting men, a superiority acquired through protecting their herds from animal and human enemies. Constant raiding and counter-raiding developed a military discipline which could be expanded and put to political uses. The organization of the Bahima Kraal was a larger collective enterprise than the Bairu homestead. The unilateral lineage offered wider political and military cooperation than the relative smaller Bairu extended family. Yeah, I can see that. Thus, even without a further development of the political organization, the Bahima had the advantage of fighting experience and cooperation. As the ruling group, and in the rendering of military service, the Bahima and their king were bound by reciprocal obligations. The former swore an oath of allegiance by which they bound themselves to follow the king in war. They also undertook to pay tribute periodically in the form of cattle. In return, the king guaranteed his client protection against cattle raiders and other enemies, maintained peace between the subjects, and assisted them materially during the periods of disaster. Thus, military service was based on a system of allegiance reinforced by mutual interests in an economy based on cattle. So they're talking about this particular region. This was their code of conduct. This was their contract. In the raising of large armies, several indigenous rulers relied on a system of vassalage based either on land or on state offices. This is what I talked about before. If you look even in European history with their knights and whatnot, they had a similar system for them. The fief system, above all, a component of the military and administrative system. Pieces of land and offices were distributed to the ruler's military subordinates as rewards. They were granted for life under the condition that their possessors perform special vassal duties, mostly military duties, for his feudal lord. So this sounds, heavily European inspired. Is it? You guys let me know what you think. The distribution of fiefs in the form of offices, acres of land, or cattle therefore meant a degree of military and administrative organization which must guarantee the regular supply of revenue and military contingents to be placed at the disposal of the ruler in the event of a campaign. In traditional African societies, the warrior was accorded much respect. He was looked up to for protection and counsel in periods of emergency. Street dudes are not warriors. Success in warfare enabled him to attain higher status and prestige in the military hierarchy of the state, and also served as a means of gaining wealth. Among the people of Kavirondo, clan heads were best remembered for their deeds of valor. Consequently, given certain conditions, the warriors as a group were quite capable of urging very strongly their views on their people or government. Worried by European incursions into the Ndebele kingdom, Lobangula's regiments, the Impis, urged the king to grant them permission to destroy the Boers before the latter grew so strong as to make their elimination impossible. Quote, day after day, the different Impis came pouring into the king, demanding the white man's blood in the country, and for leave to attack the army which was coming up to eat them. Meetings of the excited warriors were held, and it became a question whether Lobengula would be able to restrain them or not. At one stormy meeting held in Bulawayo, the old man who sided with the king stood up and said the young soldiers must fight them first before attacking the few whites. God damn! Who were the king's visitors? Look at that. And you know, there's a saying, you know, that a lot of elders, and it's still true, a lot of elders are anti-youth. There's this organization that I've gone around a couple times, and I noticed that the elders in that organization really don't want to hear anything from the youth. In particular, one of these elder women is really anti-youth. And listen, if the youth are properly trained, properly educated, they're the way you need to go. Again, if the youth are properly trained, properly educated, they're initiated, right? You gotta listen to them. Just because you're older don't make you an elder. And it doesn't mean that you have, you know, all the knowledge or all the insight. So you see this example right here. Day after day, the different MPs came pouring into the king, demanding the white man's blood in the country, and for leave to attack the army which was coming up to eat them. Meetings of the excited warriors were held, and it became a question whether Lobengula would be able to restrain them or not. At one stormy meeting held in Bulawayo, the old man who sided with the king stood up and said the young soldiers must fight them first before attacking the few whites who were the king's visitors. The king's position was now an unenviable, the whole nation rising against him, and it required his utmost tact and judgment to deal with them without losing his dignity or showing want of courage. Eventually, and when it was already too late, Lobengula consented to fight. However, the ensuing war with the Europeans led to the destruction of the Ndebele nation. You know that old saying, strike while the iron is hot? Here's the example of it. Strike while the iron is hot. Strike early. There's a point where it becomes too late. So much has been written about the destructive effects of warfare in indigenous societies that one is apt to overlook the complex codes and the sense of chivalry which often minimize loss of life. Even large armies bent on outright conquest and the annexation of territory do not always achieve the surprise necessary to annihilate the enemy in his most unguarded moments. War appeared often to be used as a lever in diplomacy and in maintaining the balance of power in a given geographical locality. This partly explains why the combatants adopted, in the main, the tactics of ambushes, skirmishes, and feints, rather than pitched battles which might lead to the utter annihilation of one party. Consequently, by the end of the day's battle, casualties in dead and wounded might be very low. The party that had sustained a good deal of casualties might break off hostilities or might take steps to sue for peace. It was therefore not surprising, for instance, that the endemic state of warfare in southern Nigeria in the 19th century did not result in the vast depopulation of the area. By and large, marriage relationship and the complex pattern of interlocking interests made contiguous towns and villages keep bloodshed to the barest minimum. Among the Igbo of eastern Nigeria, for instance, wars between certain towns did not necessarily bring to a halt peaceful contacts, such as in trade, between their people, and often the women from one belligerent town married in another town initiated moves to bring about peace. Although the popular tactics adopted by parts of Nsukka division of Igbo land was to surround a village to be attacked by night, yet a sense of chivalry caused the warriors to defer attack until the enemy had been given sufficient warning to enable them to prepare themselves for battle. After taking their position, the attacking force announced its arrival by discharging a few shots and then waited until the enemy collected and came out of the town, which usually happened at daybreak. Quote, prisoners captured were sold as slaves, but women were not touched, as the capture of women would lead to a cessation of intermarriage between the two towns. In some societies, war were not allowed to interfere with attendance in markets and with other economic activities. For instance, among the Kivorondo, periods of truce were observed during the planting season. Neither were many societies able to sustain a battle for more than a day or two. That's interesting. Moreover, the indigenous weapons of warfare, swords, machetes, spears, bows, and arrows, and Dane guns, did not cause enormous casualties to the enemy when compared with the weapons of mass destruction induced by the colonial powers. So were African wars or skirmishes? Remember, at the beginning of the paper, it was established that often these wars were just to rebalance, right, the society. It was, or the politics between two societies. It wasn't to destroy, right? So what is war? What was war in traditional Africa? If you had to describe it, what would you describe, traditional African wars? The military, therefore, was an essential aspect of the organization of African traditional societies. It shared with politics the realm of the society's greatest endeavor, and as such required the harnessing of all the human and material resources in order to maximize its output. As a social system, it was used as a method of producing and fostering group loyalties, which enabled the citizen soldiers to function under extreme pressure. Apart from a few despotisms, the military was always under civilian control, and there were constitutional safeguards aimed at insulating professional military men from politics. As in other parts of the world, the military tended to be conservative, but at the same time, such men of genius as Shaka were prepared to try something new, and in doing so set off a chain reaction whose effects were felt over a wide area and for a long time. Moreover, since the military was the creation of the society which gave it birth, it was bound to be affected by societal changes. Thus, at each stage of the society's development, a military system was established which was considered adequate for its needs. Indigenous warfare, which required detailed planning, logistic support, and intricate maneuvers, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, right? Indigenous warfare, which required detailed planning, logistic support, and intricate maneuvers, could only have been carried out by those who knew the art of warfare. Who amongst you knows the art of warfare? That's an important question to answer. Who amongst you knows the art of warfare? Who's familiar with logistics, the planning, the logistic support, and the intricate maneuvers around warfare? How can you call yourself a nation within a nation if you can't do the basic protecting of the subjects of your nation? Eventually, the indigenous military system collapsed only in the face of superior weaponry and novel tactics. So I guess this part answers my question. A lot of those maneuvers were happening, a lot of the things that we were talking about that seem like it could be, potentially European influence, or it could be just human nature. A lot of it seems, from what this paper is saying, it was, really the human nature of some Africans in the situation. Because eventually the indigenous military system collapsed in the face of superior weaponry and novel tactics introduced by the European conquerors. Faced with a situation not of their own choosing, those African communities or leaders which adapted their modus pugnandi to the exigencies of the times, achieved spectacular successes, while others who maintain a conservative approach were toppled easily. So here's the thing. About 2 years ago, I talked about what we need to do in Black society. The old saying is, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. And I said 2 years ago on the show that what Black folks should do, especially in these Democratic-run states in America, where the gun laws are just oppressive, repressive, oppressive. What we need to do is, at the very least, we should organize. And I can say it out loud because it needs to be said. And number two, apparently it's being done by these white folks already. But we need to organize ourselves. We need to get used to camping, hunting. We need to get used to the idea of having to strategize our food, our rations. We need to get used to the idea of, as this paper mentioned, having that patience and that dedication, and the tactics to be able to hunt and capture what it is we're pursuing. And I said 2 years ago or more on this program, maybe we need to start organizing paintball groups and using the idea of paintball to, you know, with leadership, you know, from ex-military guys who held those positions in the military and who understood how to organize people, etc., and to you know, to show and to teach battle tactics and whatnot. And lo and behold, if you're looking at the screen right now, these European folks are out here literally doing just that. They're literally out here teaching you paintball and airsoft battle tactics. And I'm not going to really read from it. I'm just going to scroll by so you could see some of the stuff. Look at these guys. Full fatigues, right? Look at the table of contents. Basic individual skills. What's the first thing you see in chapter 1? Warrior skills. Starts on page 7, ends on page 28. Okay? 21 pages talking about warrior skills. The next thing, chapter 2, leadership skills. Okay? That's section 1. Section 2, team battle drills. Security postures in chapter 3. Actions on contact, chapter 4. In section 3, team tactics. Chapter 5 being patrolling primer. So there's a primer on how to patrol. Chapter 6, defensive operations. Chapter 7, offensive operations. Notice they start with defensive first. Chapter 8, special operations. Then they break down maps and symbols. They have the glossary, etc. Right? In the introduction, they talk about some of the arguments for the sense of doing paintball or airsoft or whatever it's called, right? The plastic BB and paintball have such a limited range that tactics are useless. The response of the authors are, well, wait a minute. This makes no sense at all. The Roman legions, Napoleon's French army, and the American Indians all had weapon systems with the same effective ranges as paintball and airsoft. They certainly used the tactics of their day with great success. So what does weapon range have to do with tactics? And that's what a lot of our folks would say if you brought this to them. Right? But again, if you're in these places, especially in these places where you don't have ranges to go to, the gun laws are, you know, most of the time the people don't have gun laws. This is what you can do. Organize black paintball groups, and you guys go out there with someone with knowledge, or study this kind of book that I have here, right? And you go out there and you practice your tactics. So the only thing that changes in the case of something going down is you change from the fake to the real. You understand? So, you know, this is the kind of stuff. And if you guys want this book, you could join the Discord. Ask me how. Once you join the Discord, I'll give you this book for free as a PDF form of the book. Notice the images in this book. Notice who you see. Let me speed it up a little bit. Who do you see in the images? What do you see in the images? Right? Who do you see in the images? It's not us. And by the way, these books like this, they're coded books, by the way. These folks I have a bundle of PDFs that teach these folks how to make homemade, homemade items. But a book like this is just a coded way of teaching those guys how to organize themselves should some shit go down. And they do practice it. These guys practice old war reenactments, so much less something like this. And the thing about it is, this could be, it's a fun way. There's no death involved. It's fun. We could be doing this stuff, but instead, we want to go in people in black folks' restaurants and twerk. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? We want to go do the dumb shit out here in the streets and glorify all kind of dumb shit out here, but this is the stuff that we're supposed to be doing, and it's there for you to do. You can do this, but you refused. The number one thing you're supposed to concern yourself with is your community and self-defense. Because you're supposed to be trying to build a nation and protect it. The number two thing is the education that supports number one and all of it. Remember to check out that's the end of the show. So remember to check out the Pro-Black Perspective, only to say. Check out the Harsh Reality Podcast with D-Web, El Miguel, and Reese. And also check out Reese's podcast, The Queen's Council, here on KWAZ Radio. I will be back on Thursday. I'm not sure. I might be talking Shaka Zulu on Thursday. I might be talking about curriculum on Thursday. I'm not sure. We'll see. So make sure to like, share, subscribe, leave any comments you want to under the video, or you can email me or text me at the number that you see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And until next time, guys, it's been a pleasure once again. Thanks to you guys who've been in the chat room with me. If you've been here the whole time, it looks like you guys are still here. Again, if you want this book, and I have hundreds of other books to put up on my Discord as a part of my Bitter Medicine library, Bitter Medicine bookshelf. But if you want this one immediately, ask me how to sign up on the Discord, how to connect on the Discord. First things first, just create a Discord account. And then ask me, how do I get to my server? And we'll go from there. So until next time, guys, be good. I'll see you. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.